Okay, we'll go ahead and get started this morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Jason Vandiver. I'm Energy Code Program Manager for SPEAR. Hey, good morning, David. See you in there on the chat this morning. Another fellow code enthusiast and educators on the webinar. Happy to have you this morning, David. Is Energy Code Program Manager for SPEAR. Any energy code related questions, I'm happy to help you out any way that I possibly can. A little housekeeping on the way the webinar will work this morning. If you'll just type in your questions in the Q&A panel, or you can type in the chat panel, either one. We'll answer the questions at the end. I will moderate the webinar and I will be monitoring that. So if there's a question that comes in that really needs to be addressed at that point, I'll wait till a little pause and I'll have Jerry answer it during the presentation. But typically we hold them all till the end. But you can use the chat or the Q&A function. For those of you needing ICCCUs this morning, you will get a course evaluation from Liz afterwards, and you simply fill out the course evaluation, and you will get your 1 hour of ICCCUs for this morning's presentation. And the presenter we have this morning, Gerald J. Kettler. I typically know him as the commissioning guru, or just Jerry, can I buy you a beer? I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that Jerry has forgotten more about commissioning than I will probably ever know. He was kind enough to bring me in as the token ex-building official when we got a group together and rewrote ICC's G4 commissioning guideline. I was proud to see that was the first time my name has ever been in the acknowledgement sections of any book ever, and probably be the last. But that's a pretty good overview book for building officials wanting to learn more about the commissioning process. Jerry was also the lead author of the new ASHRAE, fairly new ASHRAE. I guess it's been out for about a year now, commissioning process guide. And I'll send a hyperlink to, there's a bunch of checklists to that ASHRAE guide. I'll send a PDF of the slides after the presentation today. And then for the code officials and municipal inspectors, there are some great checklists. And fortunately, ASHRAE has made the checklists and stuff free. You can get them from the hyperlink I'll send you after the presentation today. And I can also send you a sample commissioning report that Facility Performance Associates has done, just so that way as a code official, you have a better idea of what, you know, a commissioning report is not a page and a half long written on bar napkins. It just does not work that way. A good commissioning report is going to be very thorough. And anyway, this morning, Jerry's going to walk us through all that and talk about the commissioning process and building codes and standards. Super nice guy. He is my #1 go-to when I have any questions regarding commissioning. Jerry, if you can tell us, you know he sits on a lot of boards when he has all of those initials after his name. Jerry, tell us a little bit about yourself, and the floor is yours, good sir.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Jason says, my name's Jerry Kettler. I'm a licensed engineer in Texas and 80 other states, certified in commissioning on the 4 main organizations nationally, and I've been involved in developing certification programs, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through it. And I've got a bunch of other things that we do. I've got 3 companies that do commissioning and testing and balancing and lead process and air quality. So let's get started on what we're going to do today. What we're going to try to do first is commissioning is not a process that's been around for a really long time. I get real particular about commissioning and the proper application since I chaired the ASHRAE National Committee that wrote the national standard. So there is a national standard, Standard 202 from ASHRAE, about how to do commissioning properly. And we'll talk about that a little bit here in a minute. But what I'm going to do is explain what commissioning is, and briefly, just in a few slides, what the definitions are, and why we need commissioning. And commissioning has evolved now. It's been in the guidelines and codes for about 25 years. That's about as long as I've been associated with it. And the process has developed a bunch and has a bunch of documentation. that mainly was originally developed by ASHRAE and a couple other organizations, and it has now evolved into the building codes, as well as other industry standards. And that's what we're covering today. We want to explain to you what is in the codes that require commissioning and what that process is and what you wanted to be looking for in that. Because if you're going to do commissioning, being sure that it's done properly is important. So we're going to review a whole bunch of national standards and talk about some variations. A little bit of process evolution. The things we talked about is it actually started in the early 80s and started out as a commissioning guideline when some of the engineers at ASHRAE decided that testing and balancing wasn't going far enough. Testing and balancing of a mechanical system tests the top capacity or the design capacity and the design function. But air conditioning systems in buildings only operate at design level less than 2% of the time. So something has to determine whether they're operating the rest of the time properly, and that's what commissioning does. Then through the 1990s, ASHRAE developed a bunch of other guidelines, including Guideline 0, which was a general commissioning process, because commissioning can be used on virtually any building system. And it's now starting to be used a lot more on building enclosures. And it's a process we'll talk about and you'll understand why when we get finished here. After about 2000, they decided that commissioning needed a standard. Because other ASHRAE standards and ICC documents like to cite and require standards. They don't require guidelines. Guidelines are best practices. Standards are minimum requirements. So the process is to adopt a standard, and so we converted Guideline 0 into a standard, minimum requirements. And then in the 2010s, we started to work on existing buildings, because Standard 202 is about new buildings. If you're talking about existing buildings, that's 0.2 and 1.2. And now we're starting to develop a commissioning standard for existing buildings. It's going to be Standard ASHRAE 230. So what is commissioning? What's the official definition based on ASHRAE? So it's a quality-focused process. So it's a quality control enhancement for a building to be sure that it's built properly. Focuses on verifying, documenting, and all of the commissioned systems. So in this case, everything, you're not commissioning an entire building, you're commissioning the building systems. So you can pick, or the owner can pick, any number of different systems that he wants commissioned. And it can be applied to any one of those particular systems. And the codes normally are centering on the energy systems and the water systems, because that's the thing that affects the efficiency the most, but there are other things that are starting to be included, as we'll talk about. But you need to be sure that the assemblies are planned, designed, installed, tested, operated, and maintained to meet the owner's project requirements. So that's a mouthful. That's a bunch of stuff that you want to do. So you're talking about using commissioning, which we'll talk about here in a minute, that starts at the design or pre-design stage and lasts all the way through the building operation. So if you break it down, break commissioning process down, requirements, you have to figure out, what do you want the building to do? What do you want it to be? Who is it for? What are you going to be doing in the building? Be sure that the design meets those requirements and that the construction also meets the design requirements and the owner's requirements, in this case, performance requirements. And then you need to be sure that the things are tested and documented, and to be sure that the operators are trained, because in the past we've seen projects where they built a wonderful building, but all they did for the operators is hand them the keys, and they didn't have a clue of how to operate the building, and that doesn't produce good results. Then all of the items above needs documentation, needs records, and that's part of the commissioning process. So let's talk real briefly And this is based on ASHRAE Standard 202, the 2019 updated version. So these are the steps, and I'm going to sort of step through these pretty quick. The process, as we talked about, starts at actually pre-design. Theoretically, the first person that the owner should hire or contract when he's talking about a new project is a commissioning provider. The commissioning provider helps them do all of the other kinds of documentation, including determining requirements for the building. It's called OPR, or Owner's Project Requirements. Also, at about the same time, you develop a commissioning plan. What this does is it says, okay, this is what I want the building to do, and this is what I want tested, and to what level do I want it to perform. So you're defining at the early stage. Now, the commissioning plan early on will help you develop a lot of the other documents, including the specifications and a bunch of other things. Then you provide this information to the design team, architect, engineers, and that planners, and that you design things, and there's a document called a basis of design. That's the owner that's the architect and engineer's document that responds to the owner's project requirements. And that is what the owner approves, is how he wants the building built and designed. And then, as part of the process of design, you set the contractor requirements. In this case, you add specifications. Since commissioning is a team sport, there's a lot of people involved. So you can't do commissioning properly with only one person or one agency doing the commissioning. Everybody has to participate, including the contractors and the designers and the building officials, as they need to. Part of the process then is, after the design is finished, then the commissioning provider will review the design. A couple of things he's doing here now would be to figure out exactly what the details of the design is, and if he sees anything that might be a problem later. What we find over the years is about 20 to 30% of the problems that you have in a building in commissioning are design problems, and things that, if they're resolved early at the design stage, cheaper for everybody. Then during construction, commissioning provider and the process reviews the submittals, just like the engineer and architects do, but this doesn't replace architect and engineer review. Basically, what the commissioning provider is doing is saying, okay, I'm reviewing it to be sure it meets the owner's requirements. Then during construction, you observe the construction on site, do the testing, and you end up with filled in checklists and reports. And we're going to be talking about those, and those are now required by the code that you have testing reports before a building's completed. Part of the process includes issues and resolution logs that tells people, is a communication device, tells you what's a question that might be. And this helps the contractor and the owner and that resolve issues, because it's a communication thing about how to solve problems. Then there's a new process called systems manual. It used to be called O&M manuals. Now, systems manuals get together a whole bunch of things. We won't go into a lot of detail, but systems manuals are very useful for building operation and can be a requirement, and it is in some of the codes. Then to be sure that the training is conducted, that the building operator has a fighting chance of knowing how the building operates. And then you check post-occupancy operation, and you turn out some reports. Some of those reports might be preliminary, that, as we'll talk about, that you might need for the commissioning of the project so you can get certificate of occupancy. And then later, at the final completion, when all of the testing is done, you do a final report. Now, commissioning, we change gears here a little bit. Commissioning has various variations and titles. Standard commissioning is basically you're doing it to the ASHRAE Standard 202, and it's the standard process that we just talked about. Some people have decided that to use what they call process commissioning. In this case, What they're doing is the commissioning provider provides checklists to the contractor. Contractor turns those in, and the commissioning provider never visits the job site. He trusts everything that the contractor gave him. So that's an issue that we're talking about in the industry right now. Standard commissioning, go back to that minute, that you can have sampling in that to be sure that the things generally work. Technical commissioning is the next step. They test everything in technical commissioning and go into more detail. Total building commissioning involves all of the building systems and the building enclosures. And then you can get into existing building commissioning called retro commissioning or building tune-up, recommissioning. We'll talk about that a little later, but there are cities that now are requiring larger buildings to do retro commissioning on buildings that don't perform the way they want them to. Then there's some new stuff that we're looking at now that'll happen in the near future. It's called commissioning for sustainability and resilience. All of the problems that we're having with storms and floods and all the rest of that, sustainability and resilience are getting to be more and more important. Building code adoption, the needs and response in the building design. It's more complex than it used to be. And a lot of the functions on the construction of the building are done by individual contractors. They tend to work in silos. They tend not to communicate with each other. So somebody needs to be responsible for being sure that all of the various systems on the building, in the building, work together like they're supposed to. As you well know, from a code standpoint, fire code, elevator code, mechanical, all the rest of that stuff is connected together. Somebody has to test it to be sure it works together. And there's also increases in environmental control, which this pandemic is causing a lot more interest in ventilation and that, and we're not going to be talking about that. That's a totally separate presentation, separate seminar that you might want to look at in the future for how to, require people to start up buildings and operate buildings. And again, we're going to talk about the increased codes and laws. So let's talk about codes here for a minute. The building codes, the ICC building codes, you've got a basic building code, which is basically a life safety code. And then after that was developed, then the mechanical, plumbing, and electrical codes came in that support the building code and the systems in the buildings. Then some years later, we started out with an energy code. And that's when, back in the 70s and 80s, when that was starting to be developed, that was when energy got to be a big problem. And then after that, the sustainability process, and starting in the early 90s, late 80s and the early 90s, the sustainability issue, and they start calling it green. So that basically the green code, which we're not going to talk too much about today, is an overlay code to the energy code and the mechanical and plumbing. So that's why these things are sort of slanted here. Each one of them at level is supported by the lower codes. So let's look at some specific codes. And I'm going to go through all of them here, a bunch of them pretty quick. Commissioning on talk at the building code, and I'm looking now at the 2018 building code. The 2021 building code is in printing now, and as my understanding, it'll be shipped sometime at the end of October, as well as the new energy code. The mechanical, and we'll talk about here in a minute, the mechanical and plumbing code for 21 has already been published. In the building code, the life safety systems inspection and testing is required in Chapter 9. It doesn't say anything about commissioning per se, but it does talk about special inspection testing requirements in 909. Requires commissioning of smoke control systems and this is what it says, proper commissioning of the smoke control design and its final installed condition. And that's about all it says about the word commissioning and the commissioning process in the building code. But it does say if it's commissioned, it has to be in accordance with general accepted engineering practice. And most of the industry now says that ASHRAE Standard 202 is that process. Then a few other things in detail, special inspector qualifications in Chapter 17. in this case, and this relates to what, from a special inspection standpoint, some people consider commissioning providers special inspectors. They're really not from a judicial or AHJ standpoint, but they use sort of the same kinds of backgrounds. In other words, for a special inspector, and here we're talking about inspectors for concrete and steel and structural and the rest of that, you have to be independent from the contractor, got to have the right equipment, and you got to have experienced personnel. That's a special inspector. The qualifications for the commissioning provider is basically the same. And section 1705.12.6 requires periodic inspection of plumbing, mechanical, and electrical components for a list of specific items. So it gives you a bunch of things in 1705 to look at. So that's the special inspection, which relates quite a bit to the commissioning process. Let's go to the Mechanical Code. Like I said, the Mechanical Code has just been released. The 18 version of the Mechanical Code for these items is virtually the same. So the 18 and 21 code are the same here. Commissioning is not defined in the Mechanical Code. Inspection and testing is required, but can be done by approved inspection agency. So it gets back to your special inspector again. Plumbing Code, again, is a 2021, again, identical to the 2018 requirements, and this has the same requirements. Commissioning is not defined or specifically included, but again, it talks about approved inspection agencies to inspect the plumbing installation like the mechanical installation. So let's get into the Energy Code. The building commissioning definition, a little bit different. The commissioning definition is building commissioning. You say on the Energy Code is a little different than some of the other codes, and it's different than the ASHRAE definition we talked about a few minutes ago. In this case, process that verifies and defines and documents that the selected building and site systems, again, specific systems that are designated by the code and maybe more designated by the owner, been designed, installed, and function. So it's pretty much the same thing we talked about. And it talks about accordance with owner's project requirements and construction documents, but it adds and minimum code requirements. The issue there, question becomes, does that make the commissioning provider a code official, that he's inspecting code? Big debate about that in the industry right now. So we don't think it does, because commissioning providers are not trained or licensed to be building officials. So that's might be an issue, but it is part of the official definition in the Energy Code. Energy Code requires, and we got the sections up here, 4081 and .1.2. You need to develop a commissioning plan. And as you look through, and we'll sort of look at the Energy Code, and then we'll look at the Green Code, and then some of the ASHRAE standards, and the commissioning requirements are moving from the standards into the codes and into more detail in each code. Commissioning plan is provided by the design professional or approved agency, in this case, the private companies or parts of engineering firms or whatever that do commissioning. But the commissioning plan basically is pretty much the same in all of the requirements and all of the documents. Describe what you're commissioning, list the equipment. What are you commissioning specifically, and then what is the performance requirements? What are you testing to? So that's got to be decided early on, so that everybody, including the contractor, including the building officials, know what needs to be tested and to what criteria. And then functions, all the rest of that stuff needs to be defined with measurable criteria, so that the building officials, architects, contractors all know what the performance level of the building's supposed to be. It's all got to be on the drawings and in the commissioning plan. Then as part of the function during the entire operation of the building construction and that, you need to provide owner documents. And in some cases, particularly in the residential area, you have equipment labels that have to be attached. And the residential testing requires certain labels to be put in the house. And in the case of the mechanical systems, it's mechanical and surface water heating. And then before final inspection, and this is how it works in some of the cities, that we have to provide the inspections and the completion, or as far as we can go, before the final inspection is done. Then this is done by the design professional or approved agency and mechanical equipment. And then the documents got to include all of this so everybody knows what's going on. And this is a requirement. This is in the Energy Code. One of the interesting things is also the advancement of testing and balancing, that the systems testing and balancing used to be, it's in the code that you were required to have balancing dampers and balancing valves, but in the 2009 codes and to some extent in the 15 codes, it required you to have the capability to test and balance, but it didn't require you to do anything. But now testing and balancing and a report is required in the Energy Code. The testing and balancing has got to be finished. The commissioning provider needs to look at the testing and balancing and be sure that it's done properly. In this case, air systems and water systems, if you have water systems, all of that has to be finally testing and balancing, and the documentation and the test and balance report has to be reviewed. Then after the testing and balancing, functional performance testing. And there's various different levels here where they talk about functional performance testing. Actually, functional and performance are two different levels of testing. There's actually three levels of testing. There's inspection, level 1. Is it there? Function, level 2. Does it go on? Performance, level 3. Does it do what it's supposed to do? Think of that as a light fixture. Is it there? Does it go on? Does it put the right amount of light on the table? So what you're doing there is demonstrating the installation and operation per the approved plans, telling the owner and telling the building official, oh, by the way, this thing works right, or it doesn't, and here's a list of things that do or don't. Then it also requires that control systems be tested. There's a lot more control systems than there used to be. Then it specifically zeroes in on economizers, which are a requirement in certain areas, of the country, and it requires certain economizers, or virtually all economizers, to be tested and reported. So before you end up with a final inspection, because commissioning, not all of commissioning can be done before the building is CO'd. Part of the issue is what's the climate? Is it too cold to do air conditioning testing, too hot to do heating testing? And there are other things that are being completed and installed in the building. So you've got a preliminary testing report provided by the commissioning provider, puts in all of the things that worked and all of the things that didn't work and the status of the testing and commissioning at that point. Includes the results. And requirement is that this be provided to the owner. It can also be a requirement that the building official gets a copy of that before CO time. So there's a whole bunch of different options there, and it's up to the building officials to decide exactly how much information that they want to see and that they want to have on the building. Functional testing of lighting is a little bit different than the air conditioning and hot water. In this case, in the IECC, that it says that the functional testing can only be certified, that it's done properly, certified by the registered design professional. Approved agency is not included in the definition here. Most of the time it's done by the commissioning provider. But since lighting controls are now detailed in great quantity in the Energy Code, what you're checking there is all of the things that are listed there. Occupancy, time, daylights, drawings, all the rest of that is part of the testing. And the testing and commissioning of lighting control systems is probably our biggest challenge in the field nowadays, but it's very difficult to get all of the lighting stuff working properly. Let's look at the green construction code. So the commissioning process, again, the definition is a little bit different, but it's basically the same, but it doesn't say anything about monitoring code requirements. And it does have a definition of the commissioning provider. And it's an identity identified by the owner and approved by the AHJ, who manages the commissioning team to do the commissioning. As we'll see here in a minute, that's person being designated as part of the code requirements. Commissioning and performance is required. This is in 2018, Chapter 10. Is required to generally accepted engineering standards. And then you have specific equipment. In this case, here's the things that you've got to do as minimum for the green code: air conditioning, lighting, water heating, water pumping, and irrigation systems. So that's the list of the stuff that you need to have commissioned based on the green code. And those requirements are moving towards the energy code, and we'll see what happens. And when we talk about 90.1 here in a minute, we'll see what happens to the energy code based on these changes. The FPT, put it in the construction documents so the contractor and everybody knows what's going on. And then prior to building permit, as what we just mentioned, somebody needs to designate, in this case, the owner needs to designate the FPT provider. It may be an owner's employee, an independent commissioning provider, designers familiar with FPT, independent of the system design and constructions. Here again, we're looking for the independence, somebody looking over the shoulder of both the designers and the contractors. So part of the process before permit is that designated person or agency needs to review the construction documents to be sure all of the information that the contractor needs is there. Sensor location, control sequences, performance criteria, all of that needs to be in the documents. Whether you're building something with 2 rooftop units or you're building something even larger, all of the criteria needs to be there. And then prior to occupancy, that's the next level. Before you get your CO, verify that all of this installation is there and its startup's completed. Perform the functional performance testing on the systems. Be sure that the documentation is there and that the people operating the building have a shot at operating it properly. And then provide the project design and FPT documentation to the owner. And then it requires that the owner retain this documentation. The next level up for the green code is projects commissioning for projects over 10,000 square feet. Now, what they're saying on the FPT is every project that has air conditioning and all the rest of that, and in some cases the code limits it to certain sizes for example, 40 tons is the limit on some areas that you don't have to do commissioning below that level. But anything over 10,000 square feet is, in this case, this is the first code that's recognized, said that ASHRAE Standard 202 or other standards accepted by the AHJ are followed to do the project commissioning. Now, it also talks about design and construction documents. So all of the stuff in the larger buildings, it's even more important that it be in the design. So construction documents and building systems comply with the OPR and BOD. We talked about that earlier. And then the systems manuals requires, in the code here, requires the systems manuals that we talked about. Here, the listing for the larger buildings, pretty much the same thing, but it adds specifically air curtain systems, renewable energy systems, and a little bit more on the building management systems. With all of the AC and the domestic hot water lighting, it's the same thing that we saw previously. In this case, construction plans for operations. This commissioning providers prior to permit, and this is again for their larger systems, develop and submit CX plan per standards, Standard 202, get a CX provider designated, and the documents and specifications have to recognize commissioning. That's something that the plan reviewer should look at to be sure that all of that stuff is included. If you're doing a plan review, be sure that all the testing and commissioning requirements are in those plans and specs. And then a few more things before building occupancy. Again, this is for larger buildings. Verify everything's done, completed, and that the owner is provided with a preliminary commissioning report. So the whole idea there is to be sure that the commissioning is done, that the owner has this report. And there's a couple of different ways for the building official to verify that. He can ask for require a letter or a form filled in, as some cities do, filled in by the owner. In some cases, they let the commissioning provider, independent commissioning provider, provide that. Some document so that the building official knows that commissioning has been done. Somebody's going to certify that it is done, and that the systems manual is there. And then after building occupancy, there's a few things to be completed. Standard 202 lists those things, but all of the things, all of the testing, all of the systems that are completed after CO needs to be in the commissioning reports in the systems manual by the end of the project. Plans for operation are required in the Green Code, and this is probably going to end up in the Energy Code at some point too. So that's just a guess on our part. But the preliminary commissioning report basically says pretty much the same thing we talked about a few minutes ago. What did you test? What kind of issues did you have? What deficiencies? What went wrong? What didn't you test and you're going to test later? What kind of training happened? And what kind of plan for completion do you have? Basically, it's a plan for what do you got, how's it work, and where are you going with it? And that is really necessary to be sure that something gets done later. Final commissioning updates all of that, including the systems manuals to all of the latest and greatest information. Systems manual includes a lot more items than the old O&M. The old operations and maintenance information used to be catalogs from the various suppliers, and that's all you got was a catalog, and you might have a little operating data. Systems manual starts at the beginning of the project, and it includes all of the documentation, OPR, BOD, all of the specifications for commissioning, all of the plans, all of the final documents for the plans and specs for the building, any changes. And so this is a total record of how the building was built. And then it has all the commissioning plans and testing plans, all of the results, all of the commissioning reports, a copy of all of the documentation, submittals, and all the rest of that, all in one spot on one flash drive or CD, so that all of the information's there and it doesn't get lost in pieces. So that's why the systems manual is really important, to be sure that that's done, to be sure that the building can be operated. Then IGCC has another appendix, Appendix I, and this is advisory or informational, not mandatory, or what they call normative. And it includes a bunch of information about commissioning, about provider qualifications, which we talked about here a little while ago, with experience, independence, and in some cases registration or certification. Because you could require, as part of the ordinance, if you wanted to adopt some of these things, that the commissioning providers be certified. And there's about a half a dozen different certification organizations around the country that are available. So certified commissioning providers are available. Then the overview of the process in table I 101.2 has all of the activities that we've talked about before, and deliverables, and who provides them. So this is more informational than anything else. It also has a document description. It goes through all the documents that are listed here, and we've talked about all of these. It has a list of a half a page or a page here's what's in the OPR, here's what's in the CX plan, here's what's in the specifications. So this is informational, but gives you an idea of what should be there. So if you're doing a plan review or a specification review, this is the kind of information that should be in those plans and specifications. And that you could use this as a review document to be sure all of that information is there. So a lot of these codes, for example, the energy code basically comes from the ASHRAE standard 90.1. The green code definitely comes directly from ASHRAE 189. So it's important to see where these codes are going and what they're doing. So the ASHRAE standard 90.1, and this is the new one, this is a 2019, and I'm waiting for the 2021 issue of the energy code, because the energy code normally picks up most of the information and items in 90.1. So a lot of changes are happening. There's over 100 and some changes in the ASHRAE 90.1 between the 16 version and the 19 version. And a lot of those, and not number-wise, but a lot of important ones were commissioning. It specifies verification and performance testing on building systems, controls, and building envelope. So this is, building envelope is very important to the energy efficiency of a building. So we're starting to see the requirement for building envelope commissioning. Similar, but a slightly different process of building envelope. There are different standards, separate standards for building envelopes. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now you got verification and testing providers, can be pretty much the same thing that we talked about before in the green code. Commissioning providers, qualified designers, not involved in the design or construction of the project. So again, this is 90.1, new information for 90.1. Information of the permit application, again, we're talking about pretty much the same thing that the green code requires. Now, one of the interesting things is if you look at the green code, and if you look at the ASHRAE 189 code or standard, that's where most of this information in 90.1 came from. The person that, and the group that wrote these into the 90.1 code used the energy, or used the green code and the 189 document for the basis for a lot of these. So there are a lot of these things are the same. So we'll see what ends up in the 21 IECC. But again, identification, these are the same things we talked about before. Identify the provider, be sure that you have all of the information in the construction documents, and then all of the performance data and all of the other things that you need to do for the commissioning is in the documents. And all of this must be provided to the owner. It's part of the code, or part of the standard. The building commissioning requirements, again, it recognizes ASHRAE standard 202. So there's a good possibility that ASHRAE standard 202 process will be used included in the new IECC, but we would have to see. Commissioning document compliance, again, with building systems and an added building envelope must be in the commissioning document, same process as before. Commissioning providers, training, experience, equipment, and third party not associated. So pretty much, this is pretty much standard. All of these requirements are special inspector requirements. They're all commissioning and FPT provider requirements. Again, moves some of the things that we just talked about in the green code and that into the energy standard. Prior to permit, commissioning plan to the owner, designated commissioning provider, design review by the provider submitted to the owner, construction documents include commissioning requirements. All of these are pretty much getting pretty standardized, or the things that need to happen before permit. You got to have somebody there in charge of it. All the requirements need to be in the plans and specs so everybody can put it in their estimate. Everybody can do it in the project. So pretty much standard in most of the things that are happening now. Project commissioning documents, commissioning plan, design review report, All of that happens before permit. And then a preliminary commissioning report at the end is similar to what we talked about before. What did you test? Does it comply to the building systems and design and owner's requirements? What did you find wrong? Did the training get done to the extent it could? What are you doing to finish everything from commissioning and training standpoint? And then before occupancy, verification that it's all completed. The owner provided with verification and FPT documentation. Owners to provide the building official. Here's what we talked about before. There's a couple of different ways for the building official to learn whether commissioning is done. In this case, a letter of transmittal acknowledging receipt of the verification FPT documentation and preliminary commissioning report, or building official can ask for a copy of the commissioning reports. So you can have all of that documentation if you want the detail. A lot of good information in there on the drawings. That's certainly something that's a system that anything that the city or county that is doing the building inspection that would want to do on their own buildings. So these are things that would make the building, the operation of the municipal and state and that buildings operate a lot better. Again, there's an Appendix H, which is very similar to Appendix I in the Green Code. Again, benefits of commissioning, qualifications of the providers. That's pretty much what we've talked about that. Then the overview of the process, all of these things, and this is just a list. There are multiple pages of these things, including the commissioning documents and the various contents of the documents. So again, same thing we talked about before, but this is now evolved from the 189 code into the 90.1 code and may well end up in the energy code itself. Looking at a couple of the other standards, the ASHRAE standard 62, ventilation for acceptable IAQ, which is getting to be more and more important. Standard 62.1 does not define or include commissioning per se. It's not in the 19 version. But it does specify construction and startup, includes protection of materials, duct system construction standards, all of these things. And it requires testing and balancing and outdoor air setting. All of that's required in that 62. And then it has Section 8, operations and maintenance, which includes a lot of the things that the systems manual includes. 189.1 2017, I'm not going to go over that because it's virtually identical, because the Green Code, 18 Green Code, is the same thing as ASHRAE 189.1. And as I mentioned, the Green Code is based on the context 189. And these requirements basically also ended up in the 90.1s that we just talked about. A couple of the other things that we might want to look at here. The Illuminating Engineering Society has a commissioning guideline. It's been around for a while, DG-29-11, and it applies to lighting and control systems. It references and utilizes the same phases and information that ASHRAE Guideline 0. So it's basically the same process, but it's specifically about lighting. From the fire and safety codes, NFPA codes, the 72 code, chapter 14 talks about inspection, testing, and verification. And only in one section there that's shown does it. So systems commissioning testing. It mentions it, but it doesn't much of a definition. It assumes you know what that process is. 90.A HVAC systems only talks about acceptance testing. In 92, smoke control requires report of initial commissioning. It does speak about commissioning, included in the O&M manuals. And then NFPA 99, healthcare facility does require HVAC commissioning in healthcare projects. NFPA also has a standard 3, or guideline 3 and 4, which speaks to the commissioning of various different systems. Other standards, National Institute of Building Sciences, or NIBS, had guideline 3, which is very similar to guideline 0. That is no longer being maintained. It is absorbed into the ASTM standard 2947, which is the next one listed there, has the standard guide for building enclosure. So that NIBS document has moved into ASTM, and ASTM has picked up those various guidelines and standards on envelope commissioning, enclosure commissioning. There's a bunch of other programs that require and work with commissioning and things that you might run into in the application and the design and construction of buildings. Of course, LEED, pretty much everybody knows, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. That's still an active program. Still a lot of buildings being built that way. LEED is strong on energy, but it involves a lot of other good building procedures and good building aspects other than energy, including water, building materials, site things, and the rest of that are very important for a good building operation. Green globes is another parallel system that is very similar to LEED. Documentation is a little less. The LEED has specific requirements you've got to do. Green globes doesn't have specific requirements, but it has pretty much the same items to consider. From a health standpoint, well building and fit well are mainly health-based occupant performance guidelines and standards, and we'll see a lot more of those. They're very important. They're really good standards. Documentation is detailed. The CHIPS program is a high-performance school program. Started out in California, and it had a Texas aspect of it, and there are still some school districts around Texas that are using the CHIPS program. Building Challenge is another one of these types of programs. Basically, it's a net zero program, and we're going to see more requirements on net zero in energy and water independent buildings. As I mentioned early on, some of the cities and ones listed here have requirements for the buildings above a certain level, and they range anywhere from 25 to 50,000 feet in these various cities. All of those buildings in that city have to be Energy Star rated. If they don't, or if they aren't Energy Star rated, then there's a period of time, a couple years or whatever, that the building has to be retro commissioned, and the results have to be sent to the city. Those programs haven't made it directly into Texas, but Houston, I understand, has been looking at that. And there are some other areas that are considering some of these things, but basically is trying to improve the performance of the buildings in the cities and being sure that they work right, and that in that they're lowering the contamination and the global warming from the building. Dallas has a new environmental program they've just launched. They have the Energy Code and the Green Code. So, as far as I know, the only city in Texas that has both the Energy and the Green Code, but as everybody knows, the Energy Code is required in Texas statewide. If you want to go international, the Danish folks have a standard DS 3090 that was just issued within the last couple of years. The European Alliance has what they call Annex 47, which is a lot of good documents there. And those code or those email and web definitions there has a lot of good information from an international standpoint if you wanted to do some research on what the internationals are doing. Now, Jason wanted me to be sure to put my picture on here, so I did on the last slide. And so do we have any questions, Jason, or I encourage anybody that has a question on any of this, needs more information, want some help with a energy code or whatever, let me know. My email is there. Let Jason know and he can get the info to me. And we'd like to help wherever we can.
That's a really old picture though, Jerry. I was wanting you to use a newer picture. You've had a haircut since then.
Yeah.
Do have a few come in. Yes, everyone will get a copy of the slides, and of course on the slides, those European links will be active. Jerry's email will be on the slides, and I will also send a hyperlink to all of the ASHRAE checklists that I know Jerry likes and probably wrote most of them actually. See, Joey asks, is there a certifying, I think you covered this some, sounds like there's about a half a dozen. Is there a certifying agency for commissioning agents? How does a building official determine if an agency is qualified to do commissioning? And there's really nothing that keeps a new agency from coming, so I would think. So if you had a list, that list would have to be fluid. Well, what are your thoughts on certifying agencies for commissioning agents and what a building official needs to look for, Jerry?
Okay, on certifications, so you just mentioned there's certification doesn't guarantee a perfect commissioning job, but it certainly certifies that the person that's commission certified knows at least the process. There are, like I mentioned, about a half a dozen certification agencies. Building Commissioning Association is probably the top one, and that's called a CCP, Certified Commissioning Professional. The ACG organization, ABC Commissioning Group, has a certification, and the NEBB has a certification that's based on different, slightly different criteria, and ASHRAE has a certification. Now, as part of the program of developing various certifications, the federal government some years ago was starting to specify commissioning as a process, and they had the same question: how do I determine whether somebody knows something and is qualified on commissioning? And they looked at the various different certifications and says, I don't know, I can't evaluate the various certifications. There isn't a standard. So what the Department of Energy did is they communicated with and then gave a grant to the NIBS organization, National Institute of Building Science, and they did a building program that certified these, or built a program around the certification of about 4 or 5 building type people that are doing reviews. Here we're talking the commissioning provider, the energy manager, the energy evaluator, and the building operator. And they had another one for property manager, but that one sort of went away. But what they did is through the NIBS and the Better Buildings program, they got together with the industry and says, okay, let's decide how we're going to certify folks. And they developed a process that's based on the 17024 national standard, the ISO, not ISO, but it's the National Certification, International Certification Organization has a standard that require people that certify folks have to meet these certain standards. So what they basically did, what NIBS did is, and DOE said, okay, you have to meet these standards based on the 17024 international standard. You got to have skill, knowledge, and ability listings. You got to have a independently developed exam, and you've got to use a certain list of documents, reference documents. that basically are the same things that we've just talked about, but were looked at and decided on by the Department of Energy. And there's 3 of the organizations, the BCA, ACG, and ASHRAE are all certified by this function, by this document. And that whole process is operated by ANSI, which is the National Standards Organizations. And they're the ones that operate and control and rule on all of those certifications. So there's 3 agencies that are certified for that national certification. So that's the strongest area. Can there be other ones? Certainly, but those are the ones that are nationally recognized. There is a national program for certification, and those are the 3 that are listed at this point.
Okay. And then the next question is talking about, you know, as a building official, what do we need to look for? I mean, it's really just that commissioning plan. And as a building official, correct me if I'm wrong, I just need to know that commissioning is in place and the owner realizes it's a requirement. What would you advise as far as what a building official needs to receive at permit? I know they can't typically get or they could request it, but most building officials don't want to come back 4 months post CO and ask for a final commissioning report. But what would you advise a building official who's on, let's say, the 2015 IECC as far as energy code related requirements for submittals at commissioning?
I think a building official would need to know basically, is somebody designated as the commissioning provider, or on a small building, the functional testings. In other words, that person or that agency has to be designated or listed, and we see forms nowadays that lists the various agencies. For example, you're listing your testing agencies, your special inspectors. Mm-hmm. Commissioning is added to that list. So okay, that's one way to do it. It may be part of the permit application process. Put it on the permit application that you got to have a commissioning provider designated with probably either an agency or a person, and include the certification if you want to on that. You would want to know that there is a commissioning plan in place. You probably want to know that that commissioning provider has reviewed the drawings. Now that gets to be messy from a documentation standpoint, but if you've got a commissioning provider and you've got a commissioning plan that's more than just a page or 2, that actually designates all the things that we talked about, you can actually ask for a copy. And in some of the codes, it requires that a copy of the commissioning plan be submitted as part of the commissioning, as part of the project plans. Mm-hmm. You've got plans, you got specifications, you got a commissioning plan. That's all part of what's submitted for review. Then you would want to know that on the drawings and in the specifications, that the drawings, somewhere on the drawings, it says commissioning will be provided based on whatever the criteria is. And then the specifications have commissioning sections in them. Yeah. So the general contractor, section 1, needs to be manager of the entire, coordination, scheduling, all the rest of that. And every one of the sections that includes commissioning, for example, you got an air conditioning section, you got a plumbing section, you got electrical section. Yeah. Every one of those sections should have a commissioning section. Yeah. In that particular section of the commissioning document as part of that, to tell the contractor what they've got to do. Right. So commissioning is a sport. Everybody knows what they got to do, and if you don't put it in the specifications, the contractor is going to ignore it.
Right. It's just not going to get done. And maybe medical buildings or something like that. I mean, code clearly says 408.2.4 preliminary commissioning report. And, it talks about A preliminary report shall be completed and certified by the RDP or approved agency. And it talks about what you just mentioned, Jerry. The report should be organized into mechanical, surface, water, heating, electrical. I know we had just adopted the 2012 when I was building official at Granbury and had a mattress. I mean, the simplest building ever. The mechanical systems didn't require commissioning. They weren't big enough. The only two things that needed to be commissioned in the whole building was a daylight sensor in the showroom and occupant sensors in the bathroom. And I just called the master electrician installing them and said, hey, I want you to double check that these are installed correctly and working right. And I allowed that. But on a complex medical building where you've got mechanical, I mean, at the very least, you need to make sure that the GC and the owner of the building have engaged a commissioning professional, and you get a copy of that preliminary commissioning report so that you know that they're aware of what has to be commissioned and where it is in the code. Fred wants to know, do you know how well is the IGCC code being adopted and implemented in other regions of the country, especially by designers and architects and engineers? Are you working in other areas of the country, Jerry, that the ICC has been taken up and is prevalent, or is it mainly Dallas that you're dealing with IGCC?
Oh, yeah. Not specifically the IGCC, but the city of Austin has a program that is, they developed themselves. Actually, the city of Austin's green program and environmental program preceded LEED. And it's been there longer than LEED's been around. And they've got a pretty comprehensive program, and they've got a really good department that with some folks that know what they're doing and work with us. Because we do commissioning down in Austin. And their program's pretty good. I know there's some other cities other than Dallas. Dallas, of course, Dallas adopted it. If you go to the West Coast, city of Portland and Seattle particularly, has really stringent requirements. They've got the whole state is basically a green code state. Oregon and Washington are really heavy on that. California is too. California has what they call Title 24. Some of the folks, for example, in Washington, D.C. has adopted a lot of green requirements. Atlanta has to a certain extent. But from a green code standpoint, energy code, pretty much everybody has to do. It's pretty much, energy code is doable. There's not an awful lot of things that we've seen in the energy code that are that difficult to do. It varies quite a bit between if you're building a hospital versus a cold dark shell warehouse. Of course, the requirements get a lot different, but the requirements are there from a green code standpoint. There's a lot of folks now wanting their buildings to perform better from an aspect of the people in the building. Some of the younger folks are saying that they want a healthy place to work. Not everybody is going to be able to work from home forever. So it's important, and owners are starting to recognize it, and we're working with some of them on it. But if you're going to adopt the green code, my advice is to be careful. That green code has a lot of requirements, a lot of very detailed requirements. So some of which may be covered by other areas. For example, the site part of green code may be covered by your landscape ordinances. But there are details that you want to be careful on. I know the state the state organization, the energy organization, is looking at some codes for the state buildings and the rest of that. SECO is looking for some things. But there are interesting requirements. Some of the examples on the green code. Green code generally is really good but it has some details in it. For example, in the site area, if you have a site that hasn't been built on before, or even it has been built on before, you need to do a site survey. Not a big issue until it says you've got to locate and identify all of the invasive species and all the invasive plants on that site and remove them before you start construction.
Right.
That gets to be a problem. It keeps the bugs from crawling across the property line. So, and then on the other end, it has air quality testing, and that the type of testing they've got, and I do air quality testing, so that's an issue. That my point is, if you're going to adopt the green code, have somebody that understands that code help you, because there's a lot of things. It's a good code. There's a lot of good information in there. Most of it is doable, but be careful with exactly what you adopt and be sure that it's coordinated with, because there's so much of the information. For example, when Dallas adopted the green code, they didn't adopt chapter 6, which is the energy section.
Yeah.
Because there were conflicts between the green code and the energy code. They already had an energy code. So.
Well, that's what cities that are looking to adopt the IGCC. I know I sat on the NCT COG Energy and Green Advisory Board with Jerry, and we went through that IGCC and did mirror some of what Dallas did, got rid of chapter 6 and stuff. So I would, cities that are looking to adopt the IGCC, look at what the city of Dallas has done with amendments, and look at what NCT COG has done with their amendments. Would some good ways to think about it and to kind of maybe modify it a little bit here and there.
The Dallas Green Code works. We've been using it for several years, and it works.
What, last question, economizer fail rate, your opinions of the 2018 and how they've, installing more efficient equipment in lieu of economizers. I know HVAC contractors complain about economizers pretty regularly. Do you have any thoughts on economizers in general, fail rates? They normally work, installed right? Well, what are your thoughts?
Economizers can be an issue from a control, particularly from a control standpoint. Pretty much the recommendations from ASHRAE and CDC in that is that if you're going to use ventilation, don't use demand control ventilation. Just run the full amount of outside air. The problem that we get into, and we're having that problem in schools right now, that, we want to put a lot of outside air in. Well, the systems, the mechanical systems weren't designed for that. Yeah. And you're going to end up with unit problems. You're going to end up with humidity problems. And what they're finding is that humidity is just about as important as the ventilation as far as the temperatures. Because what they find is viruses love low humidity. So that's why flus start up in the wintertime, because viruses like low temperatures. Mold likes high humidity. So 40 to 60% is now the guideline. Economizers can be good. They have to be set up properly. And you have to have somebody monitor, economizers should be on a control system, on an energy management system, and it should be monitored. And the difficulties people complain about on the economizers is they're hard to set up. Yeah. And a lot of times there's not enough space to properly install economizers. And then the problem you get into is, what do you do with all that excess air into a building? You're pressurizing the building. What do you do with that? So that you got control problems on the other end. Is how do you control? A building should be under a positive pressure. That's something commissioning should provide, should look at. Is building should operate under a 0.03 to 0.05 positive pressure all the time, but it's really difficult to do. and locating the sensors and that, which is the same problem with the economizers, locating sensors and all the rest of that is a problem. Mm-hmm. They can be a problem, can be done properly, but you need to, you know, keep at it and have performance criteria in the design of what you want it to do. And it's really difficult. We've got an office building now that all of a sudden that they wanted, it's a regular VAV system, variable air volume system, and all of a sudden it says, well, with all this health stuff, we want to put in 100% outside air unit. Not for $2 million. So that's, you know, these spur of the moment decisions are a problem. But economizers, you got to be careful with them. They're doable and usable, but you've got to commission them properly.
Yeah, I just that 15% more efficient equipment in Houston makes more sense than an economizer to me. But I'm no mechanical contractor. Yeah. Well, Jerry, that was fantastic. I had one more question come in. We're a little over, but let's says Steve's asking it, so one more, and then we're going to call it good. As chair of the ASHRAE Houston Commissioning Committee, I'm creating AHJO commissioning quotient that scores commissioning code adoption and enforcement. Oh, that's more to me. I'll follow up with him and CCU on the back end, Jerry, because I think you'd be able to help with that. Thanks so much, Jerry. That's once again, I always learn something about commissioning when you're talking about it. I can't thank you enough. Thanks everybody for joining us this morning, and I will follow back up with you, Jerry, and Steve, and we'll loop in on that, what he's trying to get done for the city of Houston. Thanks for joining us this morning, everybody, and we will talk to you. I think we've got another one coming on Thursday. It's going to be a real 101 level where I'm just covering energy code basics and some simple things you can do for your home to save energy. It's not a in-depth code webinar at all, but maybe your permit clerk or some folks in the office that don't deal with codes much might be interested in it. So hope to see y'all Thursday. Thanks again, or talk to y'all Thursday. Thanks again, Jerry. And next time you're in San Antonio, let me know.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.